It's Wellness Wednesday. Okay, this Wellness Wednesday. And yes, I just got my hair cut, so I look like I have grown up hair. And if you hear loud noises while I do this, they're redoing our roof, and we weren't told they were starting because it's all dependent on weather, right? So we weren't told they were starting until late last night from when I'm recording this. So if you start hearing banging or like really loud noises, that's why. Working from home's great, but every so often there's like nowhere else to do it. And I think this is something important to talk about. I want to talk about, obviously how you say things matters, but the permission structures for certain types of talk, it's getting out of control. It's been out of control for a while. It's been out of control for like 10 years. Some of you who have watched my content for a while may recognize that I was not big on the whole punching up thing way back in the day, way back in the Gamergate days, because I talk to people who don't agree with me on things, and I learn stuff from talking to them, like how the term incel lands, what people hear when they hear that term, and how, I'm going to call out the left on this one with caveats, because the left is the group that says that how a phrase lands matters more than what the intent was. Now, I don't agree with that. I think that intent does matter. How it lands matters too. I think they're equally important. Why? Because if you don't mean any ill by something you said, one, you'll be interested in why it landed the way it did. I know I am. This is how I learned this stuff. But also, you won't accept someone telling you you intended something you didn't. I had a situation, I've lost track of time, but recently where I told someone, I thought they were making a mistake. As a friend, in confidence, it was going to go to them and stay there. And they accused me of threatening them. And I was like, what the hell? And I was very clear, like, if that claim stays on the table, this conversation is just not going to go well, because no, I wasn't. And the fact that we're in an era where people no longer understand someone bringing something to them, because that's the way I work, right? I'll tell somebody when it's before it gets to the point where I can't back them anymore. I'm going to go, look, this is getting too close to the line, because my attitude is, this is what I would want. I want to know things when I can still fix them. I will not accept accusations of ill intent. And the problem, we know the right does it with transgender people. Happy Pride. This is a weird one. This is a really weird Pride. This is the first Pride I've spent being completely ostracized from activism. I walked away from the last group I was part of because I didn't think their messaging was effective, and I was not going to actively participate in something that I think will actually increase stigma instead of decrease it. And this is the first time I can say this in, oh God, since like 1995. It's just, I cannot. And I tried to fight this from the inside for a very, very long time, saying, look, I think the messaging's wrong. I've talked to people. I've talked to the people we need to persuade. This is not working. They don't want to hear it. They want and it's interesting because this was the same mistake that the well-meaning Gamergate folks, good faith, I'll say, instead of well-meaning sounds a bit pejorative, but the good faith Gamergate folks made this mistake as well. They emphasized internal morale boosting, rally the troops statements over being effective with the people that you have to persuade. And that does not work. People can see you, especially when you're morale boosting on the internet. And right before I recorded this, I said to someone, and this was an instance where it was actually a misunderstanding, but this person announced they were being deliberately immature, and they said something that came out the wrong way. And I did what I do when it's like record scratch moment, right? Not that people use records anymore. But what I tend to say when something is like, all right, this is weird. What I say is, what do you expect to have happen here? Because it was a situation where somebody has just announced that they're not going to be mature. But it's pretty clear that they expect me to be, or the whole thing's just gonna go to shit. And that's really what it comes down to. It's that sort of, I'd say it's common sense, but it's not. It's not common anymore. But it actually does make sense if you'll hear me out. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/LeannaK. And I admit, sorry, I was taking a drink of coffee there. I admit I need someone to talk to right now, but I don't even have words about what happened in Colorado on the first night of Shavuot. It's a Jewish holiday. And the interesting thing about Shavuot is one of the things is you eat what's called a dairy meal. So in kosher, you don't eat milk and meat together. And meat is considered sort of a luxury. It's considered a treat. And so when you're practicing humility, you eat the dairy end of kosher, not the meat end of kosher. Now, you can disagree. Personally, cheese for me is the big treat. So I'm like, yeah, I have halloumi and it is good. That's the type of cheese. You grill it. It's really neat. But the idea of humility and the idea that you cannot understand what these lessons, what these religious lessons are teaching you if you're not coming at it from a humble place. You can weaponize the 10 Commandments if you're not coming at it from a humble place. And that's true of anything, you know. I completely understand the people that are absolutely horrified by the images coming out of Gaza. I am horrified by the images coming out of Gaza. I'm horrified by the images coming out of Sudan. Move the decimal point, right? You've got, about 1.8 million people facing hunger in Gaza, and there's bombings and violence and shootings. You've got about 24 million people facing hunger, and the UN Food Program delivers basics to Sudan. I don't remember once a week, once a month, but it's like flour, lentils, and like one other thing, whereas usually it's daily trucks in Gaza, right? The suffering in Sudan that has been going on for a very long time now, since that whole region is just cascading issues, and it's complicated. But I mean, it's not complicated to say that people don't deserve to starve, and yet it happens. And then it's, what do we do about it? Because it is hard to process, especially if you're looking at a picture, right, of an emaciated child, it's hard not to feel horrified and disgusted and angry. And of course, that's what propaganda does, right? Propaganda just makes our brains, someone do something thinking. And often that type of thinking goes against our best interest. And that's why we have to kind of go, okay, I'm feeling this thing. And it's okay to feel this thing. It's good I'm feeling it. Feelings are feedback. If I were to look at a picture of, a child starving, and not felt horrified, and sad, then something would be wrong with me, right? But then what? And I recognize I have more experience, more training with these more difficult emotions than the average person, but that's why I do this content. It's like this, I am not an emotional genius. I had to learn this stuff. No one's naturally good at this stuff. This is practice and learning, but the results in terms of being able to live with your own behavior are better. And there's all this stuff going around with language designed to hijack the brain into action. And the reason I said I was going to be rough on the left this time is when, people went anti-Muslim after 9/11, it was, no, all Muslims, even the Muslims who came from the countries that the 9/11 hijackers did, are not responsible for what they did, right? We knew that. When COVID hit, no, don't be awful to Chinese people because you think that COVID came from a lab leak in China or came from one of the wet markets in China, right? And that the origin of COVID is still going back and forth. And the reporting that reports on anything with certainty is just not accurate. All of these papers that come out are degrees of confidence scenarios, not, yes, we have definitive proof that this happened. And then you've got, the attacks on the transgender community, which I would have liked to see more specific focus on this Pride. It's an opportunity where people are watching because there's a lot of internal schisms regarding that. Now, it is not the majority who think that the existence of transgender people is an affront to gay identities, but there are some. And that's the thing about Pride that people don't like to talk about. There's always been infighting. And it's always limited the advances because everybody's out for their own. And there are always these fights. And to me, I always kind of, did a priority system of, okay, what are the problems we can solve right now in community? Okay, let's do those. Then what are the ones that we actually have to advocate for some sort of government action, right? Like, it's undeniable that transgender people or non-binary people who feel very strongly that they want their government documents to not have a sex on them. I personally don't need that, but there are some people who do. And so that is the thing. And I mean, we're getting regressions with that X or O gender marker on government documents because there's been such a backlash. And the backlash was facilitated by activists going out there and picking fights. And you can't stop everybody from doing it. But, there is a reality that when you advocate in public for this stuff, you have a responsibility to not fuck it up for the people who are relying on you. And everyone makes mistakes. You have to adapt the narrative to what works and what doesn't. And there was a lot of die cis scum rhetoric. There was a lack of listening when people said, I really don't like the cis thing because it's too close to sissy. And I know it's not the same word, but this was a word I was used. It causes me pain. And I, because of that, tend to say, you'll notice cisgender. I said cis there because that's the quote. But I know you say just trans because that's preferred, but then cisgender, you always err on the term of the side of where the sensitivity is because it takes less for you to do it than for the person that's having the trauma trigger. And let's face it, we're the ones saying call people what they want to be called. So if you're talking to someone and they say, I don't like the term cis, well, okay, what would you prefer? And you can go back and forth and it can be a learning experience. Like, no, you can't say normal because for the transgender person, normal is that they are transgender. That is normal for them, right? And then there's the whole natal women. And you can say, well, trans people were born the way they were. They were born trans. So I do think it's not the greatest term. It seems to be the ones we're sticking with now. And that's the thing. You can have a conversation and until you find something that the other person isn't getting a trauma response from, and you've had sort of an information period of they now understand why these terminologies are used. Even if they don't like them, they can understand them. And you can say, okay, for the purposes of this conversation, we'll separate sex and gender. So non-trans person, okay, whatever both people can live with. That's advocacy. That's what works. That's what always has worked. You use the awareness campaigns to thrust forward the individual conversations where people have the opportunity to ask questions and feel heard as well as be heard. But the particular problem with trans activism is that because the trans population, and by the trans population, I don't mean all gender nonconforming people or genderqueer people. I mean the people who actually need the medical interventions, because that is what is under threat right now. And that is a very serious issue. When teens don't get that intervention, their quality of life is disastrous. And I honestly think that if we use the whole trans teen issue to really push, like, listen to your kids, that will benefit all teens. Because, the number of teens who just suffer through bullying, who don't tell their parents things because they don't think it'll do any good, and worse, they think they're disappointing their families, they're being a burden. The most important message you can instill in a teen who's quiet, who seems like kind of depressed, but they're not acting out, even if they are acting out a little, like the idea that you are not a burden. I want to know what's wrong. I can't accept your behavior, but I do want to know what's driving it so we can find a solution here. And a lot of the time, people just want to be listened to, not just be allowed to talk. I've had people who did come out to their parents tell me that they were disappointed that their parents didn't ask any questions. They just assumed they got it. There was no conversation. It was just like, all right, shrug, And that was like, it was a hard thing to tell them, and it was barely nothing. And that, you'd want, yeah, you're glad they didn't freak out, but at the same time, there was no discussion. I get that. If something's very important to them, you want a minute of someone's time. And that doesn't mean they're bad parents. It just means, okay, you missed each other on that one. It happens, right? And it doesn't really take that much to just hear someone out and take the time to make sure you're understanding what they're saying. You don't have to agree, right? I understand the people who have been scared by this idea that kids who, they don't know any better, it's just they're insecure, they have this stuff, and they're taking hormones and impacting their bodies when they're teenagers, and it's irreversible. If that's what they believe it is, and they're scared, that's valid, even though that's not the way gender affirming care works. And I find that the people who are that scared or are concerned about women's sports and things like that, they're not in a place to listen to reasons, because they're scared. They don't want to be talked out of it, first and foremost. They want to hear, like, look, that's the information you've been given. I recognize that is, I understand why you're concerned. And giving the conversation more room to breathe, giving people time to come around to it. Even something as simple as getting them to understand, like, look, there's no sex difference between boys and girls until the ages of about 11. So going after a 9-year-old in sports, can we at least agree that's absurd? And most people go, yeah, I'm not talking about that. It's like, all right, well, there's 9-year-olds getting harassed at track meets. Well, that's wrong, right? Finding that point of commonality and building from that, that's how you enact change. When you are demonizing everyone who's just not sure, and whether that be, people who have fallen prey to the fear-mongering on trans teens. And hey, I completely believe doctor shopping happens in the US. Do I believe that a very, very small amount of parents have a form of like Munchausen's by proxy, where they're convinced their teen is trans? Yeah, that's why you've got to have doctors that can screen it. And getting rid of unscrupulous doctors, that's because the issue there is a parent trying to be special through their child. There's a much greater problem there. I've seen it. I've seen it through clients. I've seen, legal documents drawn up based on developmental delays or mental illnesses that the person who was not there and never met the lawyer who drew up the documents, it was on their parents' say so, they've never actually been diagnosed with those conditions. Or they were diagnosed and then it was determined the diagnosis was wrong. This does happen. And the way the licensing system works in the US is a mess. It is. It's a mess. It's in the mental health space, it's so vaguely worded. Oh, the banging has started. It's so vaguely worded. And it's all vibes. There's no, even things like, Trump ruined the rule that you don't diagnose somebody you've never met. There's this whole cottage industry of people saying, oh, this is what he has. And a lot of conditions look very, very similar in public. The difference between certain things is, do they behave differently in private versus in public? Or is that sort of grandiosity and bombast, is that consistent? Like, do they do it with everybody? Or are they big, I ain't nothing, I ain't shit, all that stuff in public, and then they're frightened children in private? That's where the separation happens. And the reason it takes so long to get a diagnosis is because, well, therapists in office don't get to observe people in their day-to-day lives. They don't see how they relate to family unless the family comes in, and let's face it, that's artificial. And so it takes a while to kind of tease it out, because then there are privacy things and you can't force a person to divulge anything they don't want to. And clients lie, or clients are self-deluded. And all these things make it very, very complicated, which is why doctors reputable doctors want to intervene early with a young person and try the social changes, like, okay, change the way you dress, change your hair, maybe go by a different name, maybe go by different pronouns. All of these are completely reversible, right? And then it's all right, if puberty's creeping up, we're starting to have an increase in symptoms. Okay, let's stop that process for a year. Usually it's only about that long, right? And that's when somebody's 12, 13, 14, whenever, right? And so it's that sort of thing of this is already a lengthy process. And then if they decide, no, I'm actually okay, you just stop the puberty blockers. There's no golden age where puberty is supposed to begin, right? Some kids get their first period as young as 9. You know, some boys don't start that growth spurt until they're like 14, 15, 16 years old, right? So when it used to be like late bloomer was a thing. So, okay, worst case scenario here, the kid's a late bloomer. Nothing is irreversible. It's just delayed. And it's not even delayed because it's still within the normal range. And that doesn't make some people feel any better. They're still, I'm not sure. And that is the psychology that the anti-trans propaganda is preying on. And that's when you say, like, you don't have to be sure, right? But when you're going, you're a bigot, that's not going to convince anybody. It's not. It's not like people go wake up in the morning, yes, I'm going to be a bigot today, right? It's right versus right thinking instead of right versus wrong thinking. It's this whole thing of children deserve to be protected, and people are usually flashing back to their own childhood where they weren't protected. And especially a lot of boys who turn into men who are convinced that society doesn't care about men and women get all these protections, and they were never a little girl, so they don't know it's not true. People give a lot of lip service to it, but what actually happens to little girls is, oh, they're there in public, and then the minute you get home, it's, you were this, you were that, don't embarrass me ever again, do you know what I had to do to you? That's not protection. That's basically a gilded cage. And it's, these are things that have to be discussed. If we don't discuss these things and we don't listen both ways, everybody just gets further and further and further apart until we hit a point where people didn't think that equating an entire country, all its citizens, with genocide would, convince some people who were looking to hurt someone anyway that this is a noble reason to hurt people because they're hurting people. So if I hurt people to stop them from hurting people, well, that's okay. This is why we have to be really careful in this sort of stuff. That we focus on, I even catch myself making comments about America and I stop myself and go, nope, I know Americans, they don't like what Trump's doing either. And Trump going 51st state about Canada, which is absurd to begin with. We have multiple provinces and territories. It would be like the 51st to 64th. What he's saying doesn't even make any sense. He's just being an asshole. He's just needling. He's just picking. He's being a bully to see what... And nobody voted for that. Nobody voted to annex Canada. That was not on the table. So I'm not going to blame Americans for Trump. I'm not. That particular crap was not on the table. Well, they knew who he was. No, they didn't. Trump won low information voters and double haters. Meaning they either didn't know him or they didn't like him. So you can't blame them for that. You can't. It doesn't do any good. I'm going to criticize Trump plenty, which, means I got to watch crossing the border because I check your social media. But I'm willing to accept that consequence until he's out of office or they fix this shit. But I'm not going to blame Joe Blow American. And because... I don't want somebody to come up here and get harassed for having U.S. plates. I've heard that people who go down in the U.S. who have Canadian license plates are getting told to go back where you came from, which, okay, it doesn't take certain communities much to do that. De facto sundown towns still exist in small pockets, but still... You can choose to not be that. You can choose to not pick up that virus. It's a thing where now every time I go to any sort of social events, as much as I don't agree with, I'm stuck because I have a "You Are Safe With Me" button on my purse. And so if I'm going to a more conservative leaning event, it's like, should I take this off? Whereas if I'm going to a more liberal leaning event, like more progressive leaning event, is somebody going to drop a genocide reference? And it's like, then what do I do? And the thing is, I think I've only actually taken the button off once because it was a sales thing and I didn't want to offend anyone. But... usually I wear it, I have it, and people don't know what it is, so it's fine. But the left is a much bigger problem because it'll be, and the genocide. And I'll go, which genocide? And they'll look at me like, oh, come on. It's like there are about 4 active genocides going on in the world right now, and that's not including China and the Uyghurs. Which genocide? Well, the genocide. I try to get them to say it. It's like, okay, so you mean the genocide affecting 1.9 million people in Gaza? More if you count the West Bank, double it. You know what the population of Sudan is? And of course they don't. And then they get angry. Well, why do we have to care about only one thing? I said, I'm not saying we have to care about only one thing. Well, that's bad too. It's like, yes, that's why I'm saying stop calling it a genocide. Stop saying the genocide. Israel is genocide. Is Sudan genocide? No, of course not, because not everybody agrees with that, right? There's massive protests going on, including former and active members of the IDF protesting what Netanyahu's doing right now. Can we cool it? Please. Criticize the Netanyahu government all you want. The same way criticize Trump, criticize Carney, criticize Macron, criticize, who's it, Merz in Germany. Criticize leaders, fine. But associating an entire people with genocide is no different than associating the Chinese with the coronavirus or Muslims with terrorism. It's just not so. And you're riling people up not to enact positive change, to just go out and hurt someone so the screaming in their brain stops. Because that's what that sort of emotional bludgeon is designed to do. It's designed to trigger the panic response in the brain so people just go out and do anything. And to be clear, I'm not saying that the guy in Colorado, the person who shot those two Israeli embassy workers, I'm not saying there's some rank and file free Gaza type. No, obviously not, right? The same way the Pizzagate dude was not your typical conservative. No. But the point is, do you want to make it slightly more likely that someone is going to be whipped up enough to do something like that? He burned old ladies alive. The youngest victim in Colorado was 55 years old. Like, these are grandmothers. And yes, he apparently planned it for over a year. But do you want to be contributing to this stuff? Or do you want to say, look, I want to be effective, and that's not. So what can I do that's more effective? Oh, all right. People who don't agree with me are more likely to listen to me. And I guarantee you that if you start talking about what Netanyahu's doing, even supporters of Israel go, yeah, fuck that guy. The majority of the population there doesn't like it. Stop with the collective blame, because you're taking away their voice. You're saying that the very corrupt leader of Israel right now speaks for his people, instead of the fact that through a quirk of the government system, that coalition system that they have, it's been hijacked by the Orthodox far right. The majority of those people don't agree with what he's doing. The majority of people want peace. They believe in the two-state solution. And because it's become so zero-sum, that is getting farther and farther and farther away. So unless you change the rhetoric, the most likely outcome is one side or the other is just going to get wiped out. And I don't want that. And I don't think anybody in their heart of hearts wants that when you think about what that means. Everybody's got to turn the temperature down. And it's not just on these big social things. It's about thinking that the way to approach somebody that you don't agree with is mocking them. And yeah, we all love the funny social media dunks, right? I do not expect those are going to go away, but there does have to be a line. Don't associate an entire people with violence. Every Venezuelan is not a gang member. You know? They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime. No, most of the time they're not. You can't say it's wrong when the other side does it and then do it yourself. That makes you double wrong. Because you said it wasn't okay when you do it, but it's okay when I did. Instead of saying, no, nobody should be doing this. I'm going to lead by example. And it's hard. It's exhausting. And you end up losing friendships because you go, no, I don't agree with what you're doing. But you know what? I don't think that's really a loss. If somebody doesn't accept that part about me, if somebody doesn't accept that, like, I don't like it when I'm equated with baby murder, so I'm not going to do that to anybody because I don't like it. If somebody doesn't accept that about me, if that triggers their alarm bells, if they're unsafe around me because I'm like, no, I don't do that, we're not meant to be friends. And I am okay with that. I don't think they're a bad person. We just don't share the same values. And it's better to not be in close quarters with somebody like that. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/Leanna K. Thanks for watching and be well.